Lata Mani, welcome to the new school.
It's my pleasure to be here. Yeah. Thank you for asking me.
You are described as a feminist historian, cultural critic, contemplative writer, and filmmaker. You grew up in Mumbai, moved to London in your teens, where you went to high school and did undergraduate work there. Worked as a media planner in Britain and India, and your involvement in the autonomous women's movement in India in the early 1980s brought you back to graduate school, where you received a master's in comparative world history and a PhD in the history of consciousness at the University of California, Santa Cruz. You were then on the faculty of women's studies at UC Santa Cruz, when a head injury in 1993 catapulted you into the world of illness and disability. This experience inaugurated a new phase of physical, intellectual, and spiritual transformation, deepening previous commitments to social justice in unanticipated ways. Since then, your work has drawn on secular as well as contemplative frameworks in addressing pressing social cultural issues. More recently, you have moved beyond text to experiments with image and sound, and that includes several collaborations with Nicolás Grandi, and we're delighted that Nicolás is here today, and we're going to watch one of your films. Nicolás, thank you so much for being with us. Take us back to the day of the accident in 1993. What happened?
Since most of you are Californians, this would probably be quite familiar to you. It was a cold January day, beautiful winter sun, excellent visibility on High 80, which is not always the case. I think if you've driven towards Sacramento, you know that the fog is legendary. Nothing of the sort. Everything was crystal clear. I was in the fast lane, driving at 55 miles an hour because the road was completely open and empty and free. I was traveling with my colleague who was also teaching with me at UC Davis. I was at UC Davis, not UC Santa Cruz. And on our way, I suddenly in the rearview mirror saw highway patrol lights twirling, and like a law-abiding citizen that I continue to be, I thought, let me get out of their way. They're obviously on their way to the scene of an accident or a crisis. What I did not realize was that I was unwittingly moving into the path of the truck who they were chasing. It turned out to be a Pepsi-Cola truck going at 100 miles an hour, not something you calculate when you are driving. And before I knew it, I realized that the truck was going to collide with me. There was nothing I could do. So I just held on, and I was very aware that there was nothing I could do, but quite spontaneously into my mind fell the thought, you are not going to die, you have much to do. Who thought that thought? I don't know. Where did it come from? I have no idea. Did I hear it? Did I see it? Yes. And then the kindness of the brain is that it goes into slow motion in order to protect itself. So. And it's rather like movies. Everything slows down. I felt that I had continuous consciousness. My passenger passed out, and I just saw the windshield shattering in extreme slow motion. And when the car lifted into the air, was crashed to the other end of the freeway. Luckily, it was that stretch of freeway where there is a chain link fence. If I'd hit the wall at that speed, I doubt if I'd have survived. So there was some give. Eventually, the car came to a halt. Turned out there were 6 highway patrol cars chasing this truck, one of whom stopped to see what had happened to us. So that's what happened, that crisp, wintry morning. Mm. And it was the beginning of another phase in my life. Phase of deep illness, and through that, and very, very gradual recovery, not entirely complete recovery. Mm-hmm. But I'm much better than I was for many years.
And you've written, among many other books, this exquisite illness memoir called Interleaves, Ruminations on Illness and Spiritual Life. I've read quite a few illness memoirs, and it is rare that anyone describes phenomenologically as beautifully as you do the experience of illness. And one of the central things that happened to you was an encounter with the divine feminine.
Mm-hmm.
Could you describe when that emerged and what shape it took?
Gosh, that's a difficult question, partly because you feel like a beggar in the face of an experience like that, in terms of your capacity to marshal language to describe the experience. So having said that at the outset, let me say that quite often people with brain injuries have spontaneous spiritual experiences. This is a well-documented phenomenon. And so my experience was in that sense not remarkable, fairly typical. Perhaps what was unusual about it was its sustained nature. In the depths of the injury, with everything having been shattered, all the soft tissue in my body had been destroyed. Although my musculoskeletal frame was intact, there was not a fracture. But there was the usual swelling of the brain, and it was a closed head injury and concussion and so on. In the depths of that, I felt I had fallen into a crater on the moon. In that space, I started to experience extremely powerful energy field of love and light. I don't see things, I just feel things. This is what I felt. And I felt as though I recognized this energy field, even though I had never been of a spiritually inclined, nor even in the least bit interested in religion. Indeed, I had a kind of deep skepticism, since in my growing up years, many people who openly spoke of being religious were often people who were quite sort of indifferent and routinely and casually unkind to people that they might meet. Perhaps not deliberately, but fairly thoughtless. And I could not match their claims about being religious with their conduct, and not having had any reason to trust that the spiritual life might have its integrity. Since I had not personally experienced it, I assumed that there, you might say, carelessness or casualness towards other human beings had something to do with their religious inclination. This response to their conduct, of course, is my own ignorance. Something which I came to understand when my own world was blown open by the arrival of this force in my life that I had not beckoned, if you like.
Mm-hmm. You, I don't know if I can find it here, but there's a passage, I think at the beginning of this, when you give thanks to this. Can you read this section?
Most
I don't know
certainly.
if that's easy for you. Just any piece of that. Yeah, starting at the top and just reading as
Okay.
far as it makes sense.
It's a short poem called, well, it's a prose piece, really. It's not
Yeah.
a poem. It's called Autobiography. The ocean of love, the lotus of compassion, woman born of the fire of consciousness. Daughter of the divine feminine, dancing in the joy, pain, delusion of incarnation. Searching, searching, searching outside for the universe that is verily within. The more she sought, the more she held all the pain, joy, delusion in her flesh. Twisted, tortured, bloated, doubled in pain, she nonetheless crawled across the globe, across the color line, across the sexual continental divide, seeking love in women's faces and eyes. diving deep into Marxism, then feminism, then postmodernism, then post-what? All the while, the toxins of fears unspoken, love unfelt, grief bottled, joy thwarted, swirled in the underwater world of her body. Whirlpools of pain zinging and boinging against the vertebrae and bubbling in the intestinal tract. The noises of stories half accepted, fully believed, badly digested, grew to a din. There seemed no way out. Then the big bang of a Pepsi truck skewered her out of the chaos. A deep stillness descended as the long, dark night of the soul was born. Shall I continue?
Why don't you continue to the end of it?
At first, pitch dark, darker than Kali's body, brighter than her eyes. Later, a few stars, and then the sun-moon herself. A child in a tiny boat, floating, 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 all landmarks dissolved by the ever-receding horizon. No past to hold on to, no future in view. Present continuous. Deep breathing, tender teaching, meditation. Wooed by bliss, then by a never-ending, ever-deepening devotion, the figure on the bed tossed between being bent over in pain and lying open-handed, wide-hearted in prostration to the divine. Grief, pain, increasingly dancing Kali's famed dance in her cells. And where, oh where was the past in this presence continuous? At the core of each breath, the center of every dream, the nightmare in the mirror, the demons under the bed. She was in pre-op for cosmic surgery. Nowhere to run, no way to hide, only a deeper and deeper, starker and starker nakedness. Everything stripped away slowly, gently, inexorably. And in the solitude of the ever-increasing visitations of self, she begins to speak, to weep, to howl, to scream, to release and repent. And then the crutch whip of repentance is gently removed as she is taught the hardest lesson of all: compassion, forgiveness, tenderness. All the while, the Paramatman light is falling noiselessly like virgin snow. And as she slowly, oh, so slowly begins to love herself, the lotus blooms from her heart and angels begin to sing.
If you can imagine a whole book like that, that's the exquisite nature of this memoir. I had the pleasure of talking with you before we began today, and I just find, as I said to you, such deep personal resonances with where you have arrived, and I have arrived by a very different route. But as I told you, I had a heart attack about 13 years ago, and also had a very powerful experience of the divine. That has stayed with me ever since. And but if there's a difference, my path was that I have been seeking the divine for over 40 years, you know, and but like you, I mean, you were a feminist historian, cultural critic, and so forth. But I was schooled in political science, political sociology, you know, contemporary philosophy, and so forth. And there was no room for the divine in either your framework or mine. Somehow I escaped from it earlier as a inclination, and so was kind of seeking it over a longer period of time. So I think one of the things that fascinates me most about your work, and you've written a whole series of books, The Integral Nature of Things, Cultural Reflections on the Present, Interleaves, which is the illness memoir, Ruminations on Illness and Spiritual Life, Sacred Secular, which is beautiful, Contemplative Cultural Critique, and then earlier work, Contentious Traditions, the Debate on Sati, which is wife burning in colonial India. And then this beautiful book that I look forward to reading, I haven't yet, called the Tantra Chronicles, Spiritual Teachings of Devi, Shiva, Jesus, Mary, and the Moon, as well as a series of children's books. And so it's a wonderful, and in each book, the cultural reach is just extraordinary. And just to find a starting place, we might begin with your thinking on the anatomy of faith, which is in one of the essays in your book, Sacred Secular. And so how do you see this challenge that we face of, you said, elsewhere in this collection, I proposed that we bring together sacred and secular epistemologies in comprehending the world around us. I make this suggestion in full awareness that the secular arose in contradistinction to the sacred and required its negation as a valid form of knowledge for social or scientific inquiry. In the secular culture of the academy today, the realm of the sacred is acceptable as philosophy and theology, as the subject proper of anthropology, history, sociology, as the fecund muse of poetry and art. So it's deemed a source of inspiration. It is not, however, seen as offering a conceptual framework that can contribute to understanding of things other than itself. The promise of post-structuralist theory and its bequest, interdisciplinarity, was precisely the taking down of boundaries that had hindered our capacity to map phenomena in all their complexity. And then you go on to say the forking of the secular and the sacred was inaugurated by the Enlightenment, and the Enlightenment obviously extolled reason and science. But you say post-structuralist theory developed an important critique of the coercive aspects of Enlightenment thought. However, it left undisturbed two of its key interlinked tenets, the presumption of the sacred as inevitably superstitious and regressive, and the arrogation to the secular of all that is defensible from a progressive perspective. I just think this is so critically important for our time. Mm-hmm. And it's the issue that I've struggled with a lot. And I wonder if you could sort of expand on your thinking on that critical juncture and how you see the potential resolution.
Gosh, I mean, let me come at it gradually and it's sort of sideways. And I partly do that because the secular is normative. That is to say, it is the reigning paradigm. Mm-hmm. We have a deep distrust of anything that we cannot prove, that we cannot demonstrate repeatedly. At the same time, there is so much of human experience that is uncontainable within these categories. And there are many accounts of such experience. And even though they mount, they have failed to undermine certainly the privileging of the secular rationalist framework in certain domains. We do know that there are many societies in the world where the sacred is intimately, deeply, and effortlessly interwoven into every aspect of life. So we should not speak as though the academic disciplines dominate the entire world. In fact, one of the problems that we have is that the various particulars have stood for universals. And because those particulars that stand for universals have often been aligned with structures of power, they have been able to pretend as though they speak for all people at all times, right? So even as we describe certain modes certain paradigms as normative, we have to understand that they're actually very local. So we speak of their normativity and also their inevitably local status. For me, if I can start autobiographically, since we began this conversation in that vein, what I was experiencing blew open any framework that I had been using or drawing upon in order to understand the world. And what I began to realize was that if I were to be cognitively honest, which in fact my academic training had asked me to do, had invited me to do, if I had to be cognitively honest, I would have to find a way of embracing at the heart of my attempt to make sense of the world the idea of unknowing. Unknowing, vulnerability, curiosity, fearlessness. This is the constellation.
Unknowing, vulnerability, curiosity, and fearlessness.
Yes, because as soon as you accept unknowing as a path of inquiry, where as a modus of inquiry, if you like, if you accept the premise of unknowing, then you have to allow yourself to be vulnerable to what you might discover. Mm-hmm. Because what you might discover might challenge everything that you had drawn upon in order to make sense of life mm-hmm. or phenomena up until that point. Mm-hmm. And in order to open yourself to unknowing and vulnerability, you have to be fearless. We create cognitive castles of which we are kings and queens, as a way of anchoring ourselves in infinity and not being overwhelmed by the sheer plenitude in which we exist. And we exist on the basis of cognitive and other maps that we create in order to bring some order into what we imagine as disorder. In order to open yourself to the idea that you may not understand the whole, but that there is a place for you, there is a particular place in which you are suspended between cognitive abeyance and cognitive freefall. Even as we do not have a sure cognitive foothold, there is a way in which we are making sense. Even as our language is not adequate for what it is that we're seeking to describe, we are drawing on language. So there is this continual doubleness in which we exist, knowing, unknowing, partial knowing, imperfectly grasped intuitions, certain things that appear to be clear, for which we have this certain kind of language at our disposal to describe it at a certain point in our journey. So it's a continually dynamic process, and we try to find our foothold by means of orienting points that are enabling and not disabling. Rationalist frameworks offer you a way of sense-making that work precisely by excluding all that it cannot explain. Is it possible to keep ourselves open to the fact of our existence in infinity by means and by orienting points that are enabling and not disabling? And they are enabling precisely of that which we don't know. They're enabling precisely by making us fearlessly curious. They're enabling by making us modest. We give up the fiction of mastery, and we open ourselves to the being humble explorers, conscious of our rich particularity. Mm-hmm. And we embrace that particularity as a point from which we seek to understand the intrinsically relational existence of which we are a part. We cannot stand apart from the world in which we live. We are a part of the world in which we live. We're embedded in a set of complex and ever-transforming interrelationships that are both social, human, and natural. We are connected to all these worlds simultaneously. And the languages we have, for the most part, to understand human experience are not capacious enough to allow for many dimensions of it.
That's beautiful. So the Enlightenment project and the way you were describing the cognitive frameworks that can either be prisons or openings, and this view of vulnerability and curiosity. What were the four that you used?
Unknowing,
Unknowing,
vulnerability, curiosity, and fearlessness.
And fearlessness. And the critique, not the critique, but the description of the Enlightenment project and how it led to the dominance of the secular. And that is all very clear. I wonder how you treat the Romantic movement, which for a long time in Western civilization has been the counterpart to the Enlightenment project, and which is very alive in the counterculture today, and which in fact privileges emotion and unknowing and spirituality at the expense of the rational and the cognitive and so on, particularly because it's always fascinated me that a number of the high Nazi figures were enchanted with Tibetan Buddhism. And the whole, in fact, after World War II, part of what led philosophy to the embrace of pragmatism was the fear of the totalitarian capacity of Romanticism. So you and I share an interest in reintegrating the spiritual into the context of secular discourse. But if we only focus on the Enlightenment project and its sequelae in secular thought, and don't look at both critically and compassionately the Romantic response to it, we may not learn the lessons we need to integrate the spiritual into both dimensions of the human enterprise.
Absolutely. I think I was trying to point to that by when I said that there are these. This is a normative framework, but it's not exhaustive in its description of what prevails.
Right.
And I should be very careful. I've been trained well enough by my teachers in graduate school to know that you cannot dismiss something as complex as the Enlightenment, which was several century experiment, several century development and phenomenon in a short paragraph. So anything that I might say in a paragraph is nothing but a very simple pen and ink sketch, if you like, and that it was itself, the Enlightenment project itself, if you look at from the 17th century onwards, other philosophers and historians have mapped it, there were many different strains and streams. And what ended up on top, if you like, what ended up winning is perhaps the least enabling of the streams within a very important critique of theology that developed in that time. The reason I call my book Sacred Secular is precisely because I feel like the secular traditions have a lot to teach us. They have developed wonderful categories for understanding social inequality, political structures, forms of discrimination. There are many secular concepts that are vital. I do not pose the sacred as the opponent of the secular. I feel that contemplative traditions give us some concepts which, if we are willing to do the hard work of transcoding and re-articulating in relation to important social concepts like class or race or power, or even the historicity of our understanding of concepts, we can then perhaps draw on that which is most enabling in both traditions. So I do not pose the sacred as an easily accessible, trans-historical, essentialist form of knowledge that can be counterposed to the sacred, which is somehow entangled in history, narrow and sectarian in its thinking. We have forms of religious thinking that are sectarian. We have forms of secular thinking that are sectarian. I think both have concepts that can be useful to us, and it is incumbent on us to think about how we might draw on both traditions. That's been the experiment.
I hear that, and perhaps I'm missing something, because the question I posed to you was about the Romantic tradition, specifically as a counterpose to what the Enlightenment tradition.
That is a historical and an empirical question, which I don't believe I am best suited to respond.
Okay.
Therefore, I responded to your question on a more conceptual level, because it's not the history that I have studied well enough to be able to map and say, there were these tendencies.
Well, that's very helpful. Right? That's very helpful. There are so many things that I could ask you about, and so we're kind of sampling through this extraordinary work that you've done. But one thing that tends to wake people up, and is always a good question to ask, you have in this book, The Integral Nature of Things, an essay on sex. And you start it by saying, it may seem odd to suggest that we take a dispassionate view of sex, since it has long been understood as instinctual passion. Yet, while erstwhile opponents are united in their conception of sex, only divided in what, if anything, should be done about it, we know we are in the midst of an ideological thicket, and so on. And you go on, and I'll just read one brief passage and then ask you to expand on your thinking on this. As we contemplate the interconnectedness of mind, heart, and body, we are led to discover the limitations of aspects of feminist, queer, and left arguments regarding sexuality, pornography, or sex work. The chief target of this critique tends to be the duplicity of the regulatory mechanisms of the state, law, police, etc., the double standards of dominant societies' policing of behavior, and the denial of the right of sexual self-determination of certain groups, to certain groups. Insofar as these arguments unravel the hypocrisy of normative notions and the negations and invasions they entail, we may readily support them. We may also join in celebrating queer, transgender, and women's sexuality. However, to the extent that this intervention shares presumptions with the normative notions it avowedly opposes, it fails to offer a radical reframing of either sex or sexuality. It may succumb in pluralizing the content of the normative, but it leaves its basic structure intact. So first, I'd love to ask you to just sort of summarize where your thinking on sex has taken you. But more broadly in your work, I find it fascinating that quite often what you do, which I love, is that you look at the polarities left and right of whatever, of some dialogue or discourse that you're thinking about. And then you pose in a kind of a third step back to look more deeply at the whole thing and reconsider the whole thing. So you're doing, in a sense, the same thing with whatever we want to call spirituality. You're saying, the Enlightenment, the secular tradition has taken on every aspect of what preceded it except spirituality, and sort of stepping back. So in the same way, you're sort of stepping back on sex and asking for a reconsideration. Where does that leave you?
Yeah. Let me see. One of the things that I discovered in the depths of my illness was something that I had been tone deaf to prior to that, and that was the deep intelligence of the body. I think I had been, even though as a feminist, body politics has been at the heart of feminist theorizing, feminist activism, feminist understanding. So the body had been a site of research for me. Indeed, my book on widow burning made an argument that women's bodies had become the terrain for a debate on tradition. What had traditionally been and historically been seen by historians as being a debate about women was actually a debate about tradition waged on the bodies of women, and articulated on the bodies of women. That said, I had not inhabited my own body. And with the mind unplugged by the brain injury, I was in a kind of deep free fall into the body. And having landed there, as it were, it was an entire landscape to be discovered. Not to take us away from your question, but one of the things that was understood in that period was just how intelligent the body was and how the body's intelligence had not been accessible to me since I, and perhaps partly shaped by the way the education system had trained me to think about intelligence, had resided almost entirely in the mind. One of the ways in which not just the education system or contemporary thinking, but even spiritual thinking, tends to see the body as a site of passion, sensation, instinct, all of which must be brought under control by the mind. So both, again, sacred, secular, right? There are two different streams. The body is also seen, today the body is seen as a site of desire. Desire itself is seen as being at the heart of subjectivity, as the heart of autonomy. The self-determining subject is the desiring subject. In our time, it's also the consuming subject. Aspiration is deeply connected to desire and consumption, and the free subject is the sexually free subject. Sexual freedom is at the heart of our notion of freedom itself. And yet we think of the body as nothing other than a site of instinctual passion. And the heart longs, the mind plans and plots, the body releases. So even if you think about sexual narratives, the body is nothing other than the site of sensation, and sexual fulfillment is about the release of that sensation. The mind is the plotter, the heart is the yearner, the body is the site where that yearning is released. Which does not allow subjectivity to the body. The body then becomes an object, or the body then becomes a terrain or a territory. And I think in our time when, for example, let's take the internet, the largest force on the internet is pornography. Whatever you think of it, we're no longer living in Victorian England, right? So we are now living in a very complex time where the right distrusts sex and feels that the sex and the body should be regulated. The left privileges sex, and sexual libertarianism is the frontier of freedom. Meanwhile, we live in a sociocultural space and time when the body, sex, and sexuality have become very contentious terrains on which so much is being worked out and worked through. Is it possible to have sensuous dispassion towards sex and towards the body? Sensuous so that you are fully present in the body. Sensuous so that you're not resisting the body and its hopes, its dreams, its desires, and its intelligence. Dispassion because we are required to look even at our understanding of the body as being historically situated and culturally conditioned, right? So is it possible for us to be fully in our body, fully present, and at the same time mindful that our experience of the body is itself an effect of cultural conditioning and a historically specific cultural conditioning that can be named? And is it possible to embrace and honor the intelligence of the body as we navigate the difficult and complex terrain of our times? Does that make sense?
Makes a lot of sense. Thank you. I want to sample one other area of your work just because it's so different. You've thought a lot about a subject that I've thought a lot about, which is global trade systems and what they reflect. In the moment that we're talking, in October 2016, something has happened that seemed completely unbelievable 2.5 years ago, which is that the trade treaties that the multinational corporations thought they were sure to get, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the transatlantic TTIP partnership, the Canadian EU partnerships are all collapsing. And this is due to an extraordinary effort among a network of NGOs stretching around the world that mobilized and recognized that what seemed so boring, namely trade agreements, were not really about tariffs. They were about multinationals making a law against corporations, and that that these trade agreements, once entered into, could not be left, and gave multinationals the ability to sue countries and have the suits decided in private courts and so on. I could go on about it, but it's something that I've been fascinated by and engaged with for the last 2.5 years. A lot of the best thinking on global trade and global financial structures really has come out of the third world, or whatever we want to call it, third world network. Vandana Shiva, Martin Kaur, people like that have been at the heart of a lot of the really important thinking on these structures. So just starting there, we are living at a moment, we all know this, in which the very fabric of life is being destroyed by the global system we're in. And you've written about so many of the subjects in that, whether trade or technology or just all the other subjects. I guess the question I want to pose to you is, do you see a way out of the global problematique that we are facing, in which we feel ourselves so easily to be in a system that, despite a million efforts to resist it, it seems to absorb and overwhelm every effort to reshape it. Has your thinking, your cultural criticism, and your experience of the divine led you to see what seems to you to be the most promising way toward a living future, toward a sustainable future?
Gosh. Well, my work in globalization, just to locate it, has mostly looked at the cultural logic of globalization. For the most part, the critique of globalization has been an economic one, and that is crucial. But since I moved to Bangalore, and Bangalore is a kind of petri dish for what is happening to India since India opened up its markets, I've been interested to supplement and complement that critique by pointing to the cultural shifts and transformations. That's one. That's one, just a clarification. But in terms of, I feel like we're living in a very surreal time. I actually feel that global capital cannot reproduce itself in the way it has been reproducing itself since the Industrial Revolution. I mean, it's just no longer possible. It's not a viable model, partly because the over-extraction, I think we've already entered the era of diminishing returns. And I even think that I actually think that the forms of government that we have, world government or even international institutions that currently regulate trade, people at the highest levels are completely aware of this. It feels as though every time there is a crisis, somehow the crisis is managed and we go on. But I think that we're living in a kind of ghostly present becoming a non-future.
Yes.
And the only really living alternatives are in people's movements, community efforts, people who have never entered into, people who are still part of barter economies and who've never really entered the monetary system, who still have the skills to live outside of the monetary system, and new forms of organizing and new kinds of imagination that are emerging. I actually think the future is local. We may continue to remain connected, but the ways in which the architecture of globalization that is currently in place and seemingly in play, I think its days are numbered. And I can't, it's an intuitive feeling, and a feeling that comes from the fact that that which it needs in order to reproduce itself and in order to sustain its hungers, because its appetite is voracious, it simply doesn't, it's not going to have access to what it needs. I think we're going to have issues of climate change, fuel, the sheer costs of transporting goods from China, to continue to transport goods from China, civil strife as a result of as a result of displacement because of ecological change, civil strife in this country as a result of rising unemployment, a de-skilling of the population. You cannot have a population of service providers and consumers who simply do not even have the educational opportunities to enter an imagination, Silicon Valley fed imagination that this can be the laboratory of innovation and experimentation. It can be produced, the goods can be produced somewhere else, and your own population can simply consume. It's just not tenable. I don't think it's tenable. So do I have hope? Absolutely, because as we know, even if you're not at all spiritually inclined, the ant can kill the elephant by biting the elephant in its ear. It's always the small guys in working collectively, working flexibly, working cooperatively, working with a broader imagination than that of selfishness. These are the forces that have always prevailed over time. But I think our sense of time has to be opened out. We live in a very instant gratification world. We live with a notion of time that's very short term. If I have hope, it's because I have a more Brodelian notion of time, or even broader than that, cosmic notion of time. A sense of cycles, a sense that nature always moves towards healing. There are any number of stories of things restoring themselves when left alone. A lot of the chaos and the strife that we have created has been the result of conscious and systematic interventions, human interventions. If we withdraw from those forms of intervention and allow other forms, allow things to be, even allow humans to be, to reimagine new forms of localism. The question is, are there going to be new forms of localism or new forms of parochialism? And that is where I think, social justice movements that are very conscious of our deep interdependent existence across vast spaces, and the fact that we live in one world, one earth, one cosmos. Those forms of understanding that we do not exist alone, and we cannot have a future where we escape the mess we've made here and go to Mars or some other planet and start all over again. I think these are the forms of imagination that are going to prevail.
I would just love to keep talking with you, but we want to watch this 62-minute film, and I wonder if you would briefly introduce it, and then we'll watch the film, and then we'll reconvene after that to just chat a little bit more. So typically, I just want to say to you all, we usually run a very structured 2 hours till 4, and today we're going to run a little over. We'll probably end just a little, the film will end at about 4:10. And we'll probably talk a bit after that. But those of you who need to leave at some point can take that into account. So would you like to introduce the film briefly?
Absolutely. It's the film is called, it's a project. The project is called The Poetics of Fragility. Very much connects to the issues that we've been speaking about. It's a transmedia project, by which I mean it's a film, an artist book, and a website. And the three are like three sides of a triangle. The project can be understood in its richest sense when all three are encountered and enjoyed. And they three complement each other. It's a bilingual project. It's Spanish as well as English. And it's a meditation, really, or a set of reflections on a very simple proposition. We tend to think of fragility and strength as opposite to each other. And we are thinking these two terms as co-implicated. That fragility implies strength and strength fragility. There's no strength without fragility and no fragility without strength. What we are looking at here is nature, the idea of fragility and strength as in a beautiful pas de deux or dance in nature, as well as in relation to bodily fragility. But as you will see, what we are saying here about bodily and social bodily fragility also relates to the idea of social fragility, and that is something perhaps we can talk about after the film.
Thank you.
It would be very difficult to categorize ourselves in I do this, Lata does that, but we have such a synergy that it's a really porous way of approaching. For sure, I bring my craftsmanship here because I was trained as a filmmaker, and Lata has her trajectory, but we have this beautiful dance between us in which there's an understanding and a trust in the process of creativity as such. And together we have developed this inquiry that we call video contemplation, in which it's a kaleidoscopic way of exploring a subject, a question, a topic, in which we have the topic and with different kind of lenses we see and we expand the ways of seeing that same topic. That's why we find lots of poetry, storytelling, there are sutras, there are teachings, and that is weaved into this particular narrative that we call video contemplation.
Thank you. And Sanjay, you are a producer of this. How did you become involved and what drew you to it?
I think my involvement is more from the perspective of the subject. The subject really interests me. I mean, I don't know of anyone in this room who hasn't grappled, and I use the word grapple consciously, who hasn't grappled with the idea of fragility, because I think if you live long enough, you are confronted by the fragility of your own body, the fragility of your ideas, the fragility of your life plans and everything else. I mean, Lata and I, we did another film, Nicolás, Lata and I, it was called The Tantra of Embodiment, The World in this Axis, and We in Us, the Tantra of Embodiment, but that explores the tantric approach to this idea of embodiment. I mean, in the sense of, I think so much of our lives is spent in the effort to rise up, to transcend, to move beyond. In one sense, to be intensely involved in our own lives, but to also be very proficient escape artists. And I think what fragility does is that it forces us to be present, to sit and to accept. And I think in that, I think one comes to a point of seeing an incredible amount of strength, a strength that is so counterintuitive that you never ever thought that you would find in just accepting the body as what it is and what it does and how it grows into it, and to accept that no gesture is inconsequential, and so in one sense I think I come to this from a perspective of inquiry, from my own journey. The video contemplation that Lata and Nick have done together, and something that Nigar and I have supported, is one way of approaching this topic. And of course, Lata's writings that you've kind of traversed through has also been a very important part of it. And hopefully, at least my own interest in being involved in something like this is not just a personal inquiry, but what you're going to come to right now, which is the how do we explore social fragility from a narrative of personal fragility, and what does that mean to acknowledge that it's not just one is fragile and one accepts that and is present to that, and therefore in that sense you are liberated, but also what does it mean to acknowledge that we collectively are fragile, and what does it therefore mean to whether we other people, or how do we deal with others, or how are we connected? I think that's a key question. I feel that that's the next tangent that would come from this.
Absolutely. Thank you. I want to harvest any brief comments that anyone has, questions, anything, and then we'll do a closing segment. Diana, you look like you're about to say something.
Well, I wasn't earlier, though.
Mhm.
Before the film, I could hardly refrain from saying I thought this was thrilling, your dialogue with each other. It's not something I get exposed to in Bolinas very often. And I guess I crave it now that I heard it more. And a question did come to mind. You had said that your spiritual experience was different because its duration was different. You didn't say how long it lasted, like if it's just ongoing or...
Oh, you mean the experience of
From
this
the
energy field? Well, initially it sort of came, it sort of ebbed and flowed, but I think it was like a calling card to actually do some practice. And with sustained practice, there's a much more continual sense of connection.
Any other comments before we do a closing segment? Yeah.
I would just like to say that I'm here because I heard your discussion on KPFA,
Okay.
and I was just, mesmerized. It was wonderful. And I'm so glad that I was just awake at that moment, and also that I'm leaving today with just such a great sense of gratitude and appreciation for my own fragility and for the fragility of all other beings in the world around me. And I thank you for that.
Oh, you couldn't have said anything better than that. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Any other comments? Yeah.
You and I think in the film as well, there was talk of how hard it is putting these things into words, and I'd be interested. I've been aware of the truism of you can tell what's taboo in a culture by what there's no vocabulary for. And so I'd be interested in your thoughts about that aspect of finding words for these things.
It's a beautiful question. It was very strange, as feminists, we were often arguing that there wasn't enough adequate language for women's experience, for example. But I must say that the experience of this deep illness made me feel that even more profoundly, because there seemed no way to communicate to anyone what the world that one was inhabiting. I think that the very sight of one facing such a complex and profound challenge drove everyone away. And it's because of the way in which we have come to understand illness or an interruption of what might be called an able-bodied life as nothing other than a catastrophe. And so the only way it seemed to me that I could find language was to really become, if you like, a poet and a scientist at the same time. That is to say, paying attention to the texture of the experience and taking every aspect of it seriously and approaching it not with rage, grief, frustration, and shame, all of which one experiences continually when one finds oneself in a place that one can't plan one's way out of, right? Or rise above. All of those strategies for coping with something uncomfortable are not available to you. You're just too weak, and you have to be as you are, as is, where is. So you're dropped into the present, and that's a great gift. It doesn't feel like a gift at the beginning, but it becomes a gift. And once you're dropped fully into the present, and you slowly cultivate the courage to be in the present, you can then open, and if you allow yourself to be curious, if you allow yourself to embrace the unknowing, and if you allow yourself to be fearless, language arises. The body or the heart or the mind will propose a color or an image or a texture or a sensation or a feeling. And if you follow it and allow yourself to follow the trail, something will speak. Truth will speak itself in some way. If you start editing, which is what we tend to do to bring control to what feels like an amorphous and chaotic infinite mess, if you start editing, you don't allow that process to come to fruition. Once a lot of the material that I wrote was dictated because I couldn't read and I couldn't hold a pen, and so it was audio journaled. Eventually, that was edited. So this is not a stream of consciousness work. It was finally consciously crafted and edited, but it was about getting out of the way and allowing the body to tell its truth, allowing the heart to speak its truth, and allowing the mind to speak its pain. Each had something to give. Each is a form of intelligence, and it's when we allow them to dance in a triadic fashion that we benefit from the fact that we have been bequeathed or gifted this triadic intelligence, which we have not learned how to access or trust.
Thank you very much.
The colleague who was traveling with you in the car, was that Ruth Frankenberg or someone else?
No, that was somebody who was in my department, who was another professor at UC Davis.
And what happened to...
Well, she was out of sorts for 6 months, took 6 months off, 2 terms off teaching, and then slowly went back to work. It was my side of the car that was hit.
That was hit harder.
Yeah.
I want to go back to part of that beautiful autobiography prose poem that you read. There's a segment there that you say, the noises of stories half accepted, fully believed, badly digested, grew to a din. There seemed no way out. Then the big bang of a Pepsi truck skewered her out of the chaos. A deep stillness descended as the long, dark night of the soul was born. So as I read that, it sounds as if this came at a moment in your life in which the noises of stories half accepted, fully believed, badly digested had grown to a din and there seemed no way out.
Yes, but that was understood retroactively,
Right, I understand.
retrospectively.
Retroactively, that's
Yeah.
what I mean.
Right, exactly.
So that retroactively you saw...
all that had to be marginalized, suppressed,
Right,
not attended to in
Right.
order that a certain fiction of self could be lived out.
right, exactly.
Right?
Okay.
So the autonomous self would be one concept.
And so where did the Tantra Chronicles came after your accident, is that
The
correct?
Tantra Chronicles were teachings we received after the accident.
And
yes.
you received them with your beloved friend Ruth Frankenberg.
That's correct.
And she and you were partners for how long?
At that point, 10 years.
But you had 27 years,
Eventually 23 years.
23 years together.
Yes.
She finally died of lung cancer
That's correct.
in Bangalore.
In Bangalore.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But she was both a profound intellectual partner in your work, but also the love of your life.
That's correct.
Yeah.
That's correct.
And so the Tantra Chronicles, which you're going to be kind enough to send me a copy of, because I really, but they're 43 original spiritual teachings from Devi, Shiva, Jesus, Mary, and Moon, received and compiled by Ruth Frankenberg and Lata Mani. The teachings are revolutionary and contain the intellectual and spiritual wisdom sorely needed to correct our current course as a human collectivity. And then the introduction is by Devi, one of the teachers. Was that received by you or by Ruth?
All the teachings were received in her body.
Okay.
By her. It was a process, it was a very synergistic process. We both needed to be in meditation. She could only receive if we were both in a particular state of consciousness. But they were received in her body, and they were transcribed by me as part of my healing.
I see. Could you read Devi's words from the introduction?
Certainly. Why this book, and why now? The Tantra Chronicles is directed to members of the human subdivision because Tantra is in urgent need of being restored to human consciousness. Tantra itself is not in need of restoration, for its existence is entirely untouched. However, the truth of Tantra needs to be chronicled from the purview of some of its major participants. When I speak of restoring Tantra to human consciousness, then I'm speaking of restoring humans. I'm asking you to listen closely and to contemplate as we tell you who you are. This reintroduction to Tantra for the sake of my human children is being undertaken at a time when it is frequently said that the world is spinning faster than ever before. While this description is not literally true, it is metaphorically potent. The continuing rearticulation of humans into an array of always diverse actions and consequences is moving quite quickly. Indeed, it is at times moving so quickly that it becomes well nigh impossible for humans to grasp what they are doing and what its consequences might be until it is too late to constrain or contain the problematic outcomes of particular developments. Having said this, let me also state the reality that there is always a way to revise and restore. And this is equally true for human understanding of Tantra. The rest of the planet is already living in accordance with Tantra. That's the first two paragraphs.
So this was, in some sense, channeled when you were both in meditation. You were living in different places because work required that.
No, when we were doing this work, we were in the same room.
Oh, wonderful.
Same
Okay.
room.
So it required that you both be in meditation at the same time, and then it would come through her body.
Yes.
And again, I want to read, the teachings are revolutionary and contain the intellectual and spiritual wisdom sorely needed to correct our current course as a human collectivity. Lata Mani, I just want to say that preparing for this conversation and having the conversation with you has been extraordinarily touching and powerful for me. Because we had the film, we had less time than I would have liked to explore your work in more depth. I hope that life gives us another opportunity to continue the conversation. I would love to do that if there is such a possibility. And for now, I simply want to thank you for being with us at the New School.
It was my pleasure, and thank you for this wonderful opportunity. And thank you so much for taking the time that you did to look and read and ask these deep questions. I'm not sure I was equal to them, but thank you
It
for
was
the
a joy.
chance.
And thank you all for being here. Real pleasure.